In fact, my first guest that I would like to introduce on the show would be Youdon Aukatsang, who's the MP, Central Tibet Administration, and she has been for far too long striving for the rights of the Tibetans and has been fighting for the youth of Tibet and human rights as well. Welcome on the show. And my first question to you, of course, is going to be, in wake of the latest transgression, the aggression that has been shown by China along the LAC, how does this impact Tibet personally?
Well, as a Tibetan born and living in India, I've been really following this news of Chinese aggression and bullying tactic on the Indian border in Ladakh with a lot of concern. You know, China is really trying to change the realities on the ground by stationing military 60 kilometers into Indian territories, the same tactic that they're using in the South China Sea as well. So this is not the first time that China has encroached the Indian soil, and this will not be the last time also. Lasting solution to this frequent border aggression from China would only be solved if you reinstate Tibet as a buffer zone. And that will happen only if there is with the resolution of Tibet issue. I think that is something that we need to look into, and India must support dialogue between the Tibetan representatives and the Chinese counterpart. And with this, we can have a peaceful border, and India can then look for a lasting peaceful solution to the border.
Right, Youdon, but also tell me about the fact that is going ahead and fighting for free Tibet and finally getting the rights of the Tibetan peoples and the land of the Tibetan people going to finally resolve this LAC, very, very strategic point over here between India and China?
Yeah, I said this already. See, my main stress that I was giving as I spoke earlier is that Tibet was traditionally a buffer zone between India and China. And it's only after Chinese illegal occupation of Tibet that India has been facing this over the last many years, India has been facing a lot of border tension. So once we have a resolution to the Tibet problem, Tibet will be back as a buffer zone, and then you will not have this problem that we are facing every year. Yeah.
And obviously China has been going ahead with its expansionist adventurism, be it Hong Kong, be it Taiwan, and Tibet. It happened 60 years ago. History is repeating itself. If you go about reading Mao's statements back in the day, in the 1990s, he had gone about saying that it is in fact the point of the palm being Tibet and the rest of the 5 fingers being Bhutan and Sikkim and Arunachal and Nepal, and it's slowly actually bringing about its strategies, nibbling away into Indian land, nibbling away into Nepalese land by its economic strategies, by the CPEC. How exactly do you stand when it comes to the Chinese One China policy?
Well, as a Tibetan Member of Parliament, we have at the moment a middle way approach policy, which means that we are now, in a situation where we are trying to find a mutually beneficial solution to the situation inside Tibet. And with that, we will be with China, but we would like to be self-governed. We would like to have a voice in everything that we do ourselves. And when it comes to the border, there is a vision of His Holiness that we want to have a zone of peace. So I think that will be implemented, and that's what, as a Tibetan Member of Parliament, I'm kind of supporting at the moment.
Youdon also talked to me about what exactly is the ground situation of the Tibetans, of the people of Tibet. There have been news that have been coming in the past as well, past few weeks as well, that there are human rights violations that China continues to meet upon the Tibetan people. If you could share some instances, and what exactly have you been doing to mitigate this entire process and to pick this topic up and go to the highest levels, highest echelons across the world in United Nations and other international bodies to wake up these nations and tell the truth that Tibet has been facing for far too long?
Well, China at the macro level is really cynicizing Tibet through indoctrination and wiping away the traditional way of life in the name of development. With this imposed Chinese model of development, there comes a huge influx of Chinese workers and setting up of Chinese businesses. Tibetans in Tibet do not have actually the basic right to freedom of expression, right to assembly, freedom of religion, freedom to be educated in their own language, freedom of movement, and all the freedoms that we in the free world take for granted. So that is the biggest problem that we have. And in addition to that, what now China is doing is that there is a huge, China's whole apparatus of military, police, the surveillance teams is really there to monitor and suppress any potential protest in every monasteries, in villages, in towns, in cities of Tibet. So it's also relying on technology. We know that there is, even when people use stuff like the Chinese apps like WeChat, if they say something that is so quote unquote against the, which is hampering Chinese national security, they could be arrested just by talking something that is kind of described as against the Chinese national interest. So that's another one. And because of all this, there is a huge clampdown on the protest, and there's a huge surveillance, and there's no space for dissent. And as a result, since 2009, we've had about 154 self-immolations inside Tibet. People have resorted to self-immolation to protest against the brutal policies of Tibet. And we in the free world, we are their voice. We are the voice for the voiceless. And we are doing our best to take to kind of highlight and kind of advocate for them, not just at the levels of the governments and at the parliament, but also with the masses. And in that, we not just the Central Tibetan Administration, but we have Tibetan organizations, Tibet supporters. Everybody is doing their work to highlight the situation of Tibet and to find some solution to this kind of continuous brutality inside Tibet.
So Youdon, also tell me, if the Tibetans were given support from India and other nations, would you come ahead and fight against the Chinese autocracy?
Well, we are at the moment, the Central Tibetan Administration, like I told you, we have this middle way policy, and we are fighting. Our fight is a non-violent fight. So we are doing that through our protests, through our campaigns, through our advocacy. We are fighting, and we'll continue to do that. I think what is required is that the world must realize that there's a need to contain China. The world has made China what it is today. China has become this second largest economic power, but China is not content with that. What China is doing, we Tibetans are facing colonialism, but I say that the world is also facing Chinese colonialism. China wants to dominate the world in this new world order China wants to build. It wants to have a dominance over every sphere, whether it's technology, whether it's military, whether it's ideology, whether it is, so at every sphere, China wants to kind of have a say and have a sphere of influence. And they're doing that through, when it comes to countries like Africa, Asia, Latin America, they're using aid and development assistance for influence. And then we all know, right, what China is doing with the international organizations such as the WHO, the World Bank, the IMF, and the UN. It is using the same tactic of kind of helping them with aid, with development, with assistance, actually, as a donor agency. And then technologically, we know also that China is really into it's one of the countries in the world which is really ahead in terms of hacking and they want to really control the data of the world. So they're using all the apps that you see around. So we need to really come down strongly on all that. The world needs to really wake up. The world needs to realize that China is not just colonizing Tibet and not just kind of pressing down on people of Hong Kong or Uyghur or Taiwan, but it's also trying to dominate the world. This is the new era where Chinese colonialism is really there, and the world needs to wake up to that fact. And we have witnessed the bullying, the aggression on the Indian soil in Ladakh. We have also seen in Africa, in Asia, in Latin America, in Nepal, and then through countries of, even in Eastern Europe, we see through technology, through economy, they're trying to kind of control and get a sphere of influence and dominate those countries. And so I think that's very important, that we need to wake up to the fact. And the fact that China also is using Confucius Institutes as a front. They have these Confucius Institutes.
Yes, and okay, and then
all over the world.
Absolutely, yeah. They are. And one last message. Should the Nepalese trust the Chinese with all that has been happening when it comes to the change in the map, in increased aggression along the Indo-Nepalese border, and how China has been using Nepal as a proxy against India now? Well,
Nepal is a small country that's landlocked between India and China. And I know that it's a small country, but yet it must not trust China, and it should not trust China, because China cannot be trusted. We know that China is in this game for of colonialism to expand and to have a sphere of influence. So it's going to buy into everything. In Nepal, we know that China is hugely invested. They have this huge Lumbini project. They're trying to get into every sphere of the Nepalese life. So I think Nepal knows that it cannot trust China, but I think it is not in a state to stand up, but it must. India definitely must stand up. I think more than Nepal, India has to stand up against China, because India has a huge stake and India has the capability and the capacity to do that, unlike Nepal.
Right, absolutely. I thank you, Youdon, for joining us on the broadcast and sharing your views.
For more such videos, subscribe to the NewsX YouTube channel, hit the bell icon.